The world outside the stagecoach was the color of dust and bone. For 3 days, Ilara had watched the Wyoming territory unfold, a relentless panorama of scorched earth and endless sky. The sagebrush hills rolled on, burned to the pale gold of a lion's pelt by the late summer sun. In the far distance, a line of mountains tore at the horizon, their jagged peaks like the broken teeth of some long-dead beast. The land was vast and empty, a place that did not seem to care if a soul lived or died upon it. Inside the coach, the world was small and suffocating. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and the fine, choking dust that seeped through every crack in the worn leather. Ilara sat pressed between a portly man in a sweat-stained suit who snored with a wet, rattling sound, and a stern-faced woman who clutched a Bible to her chest as if it were a shield against the wilderness and all the sinners within it. Across from her, 2 prospectors with wild beards and wilder eyes argued in low, gravelly tones about a claim near the Sweetwater River. Every lurch and shudder of the coach was a jarring impact that traveled up her spine. The relentless motion had worked a deep ache into her bones, a constant companion to the knot of anxiety coiled in her stomach. She held a small, worn valise on her lap, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle. It contained everything she owned in the world: 2 simple calico dresses, a change of undergarments, a brush, and a small bar of lilac soap she had saved for this new life. Almost without thought, her right hand moved to her left, her fingers tracing the smooth, unblemished surface of the white cotton glove that covered her from fingertips to wrist. She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle, ensuring the cuff was tucked neatly beneath the sleeve of her dress. It was a constant, unconscious gesture, a nervous habit that had become as much a part of her as breathing. The glove had to be perfect, secure. It was her armor. Her mind, a place she could not escape, was a far more turbulent landscape than the one outside. She was running from the grimy, gaslit streets of a city that festered with corruption, a place where a woman's worth was measured in the coin she could fetch for a man. She was running from a past that felt like a physical stain upon her skin, a darkness she feared she would never outrun, no matter how many miles the stagecoach put between her and that life. And she was running toward a man she knew only from a single letter. His name was Caleb Thorne. His handwriting was stark and spare, the words chosen for economy, not comfort. He owned a ranch. He was a widower. He sought a wife to keep his house and be a companion. He had enclosed the money for her passage. That was all. There was no poetry, no gentle persuasion. It was a proposal as stark and practical as the land he presumably lived upon. A prayer, thin and desperate, circled in her thoughts. Let him be a decent man. Let him be kind. She did not ask for love, or even affection. She had long since learned that such things were luxuries she could not afford. She asked only for decency, for a life that was not ruled by fear. This was her only chance. There was nowhere else to run. If this failed, the vast, uncaring wilderness would be a fitting place to disappear entirely. The stagecoach slowed, its creaks and groans deepening as it pulled into what passed for a town. Redemption. The name seemed a cruel joke. It was little more than a single, wide street carved from the dust. A saloon with bat-wing doors stood opposite a general store, its porch sagging. A blacksmith's hammer rang out with a sharp, rhythmic clang, the only sign of industry. A few other rough-hewn wooden buildings leaned against each other as if for support. As Ilara stepped down from the coach, her legs unsteady, she felt the town's gaze settle upon her. It was a heavy, physical weight. Men lounging on the porch of the saloon stopped their talking, their eyes sweeping over her, a slow, leering appraisal that made her skin crawl. Women, peering from behind the curtains of the mercantile, wore expressions of pinched suspicion. She could hear their unspoken thoughts as clearly as if they'd been shouted. Mail-order bride, a woman of questionable character, desperate, damaged. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling exposed, a specimen under glass. A man was waiting by the stagecoach office, his posture still and watchful. He was taller than she had expected, with shoulders broad enough to block the sun. The face beneath the brim of his dusty hat was weathered and sun-beaten, etched with lines of hardship that made him look older than the 30 years he'd claimed in his letter. His eyes, when they met hers, were the color of a winter sky, a startlingly pale gray, and they held no warmth, no welcome. They were cold and distant, the eyes of a man who had seen too much and felt too little. "Ilara?" he asked. His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges like he didn't use it often. She could only nod, her throat suddenly tight. "Caleb Thorne," he said, by way of introduction. It was not a greeting, but a statement of fact. He gave her a single assessing glance, then turned his attention to her lone valise, which the driver had tossed into the dust. Without another word, he lifted the bag as if it weighed nothing and loaded it onto the back of a simple buckboard wagon nearby. His movements were economical, efficient, and entirely devoid of any gentleness. He had the quiet competence of a man who worked from sunup to sundown, but none of the softness of a man who shared his life with anyone. The wagon ride to his ranch was a journey through a profound and immense silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels, the soft jingle of the horses' harnesses, and the lonely whistle of the wind as it swept through the tall, dry grass. The sun beat down, and the silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing mile. Caleb Thorne sat beside her, a wall of stone, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He pointed once with his chin. "Black Creek runs dry in a month." Later, he nodded toward the distant mountains. "Laramie Peak is to the east. You can see it on a clear day." His words were curt, factual statements about the land, offered up like landmarks on a map. He made no attempt at conversation, asked her nothing of her journey, nothing of the life she had left behind. Ilara's fragile hope, which had flickered so bravely during the long stagecoach ride, began to curdle into a cold, heavy fear. She had prayed for a decent man, and perhaps he was. But he was also a stranger, a fortress of solitude whose walls seemed impossibly high. She was a fragile vine, and there was no purchase to be found on this surface of smooth, hard stone. They arrived at the Thorne Ranch as the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long, skeletal shadows across the land. The homestead was as stark and isolated as the man himself, nestled in a shallow valley that offered little protection from the wind. The house was a simple but sturdy log cabin, built to endure rather than to comfort. A well-kept barn and several empty corrals stood nearby. The entire place was clean, orderly, and well-maintained, but it felt empty. It was a home devoid of any personal touches, any sign of softness or joy. It was the dwelling of a man who did not live, but merely existed. Caleb led her inside. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves holding basic provisions. It was scrubbed clean but felt unlived in. "This will be your room," he said, pushing open a door. The space was small and sparse, containing a simple bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden chest for her belongings, and a single window that looked out onto the vast, empty prairie. The view was of nothing but grass and sky. He stood in the doorway, his large frame filling it. "I expect you to earn your keep. You'll cook the meals, keep the house clean. There's a garden out back that needs tending, and a few chickens for eggs. I paid your passage. This is how you'll pay me back." It was a business transaction, laid out in plain terms. There was no mention of companionship, no pretense of a shared life. The loneliness of the place pressed in on her, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. This was not a new beginning. It was just a different kind of cage, larger perhaps, but a cage all the same. The wedding took place the very next day. The swiftness of it left her reeling. Caleb took her back to redemption in the buckboard, the ride just as silent and unnerving as the one before. The traveling preacher was a gaunt man with a thin coat of dust on his black suit, his office smelling of old paper and stale tobacco. The town sheriff, a man with a heavy mustache and weary eyes, was called in to serve as a witness. His gaze lingered on Ilara, and in it she saw a mixture of pity and suspicion that made her want to shrink away. The ceremony was over in minutes. Caleb's vows were spoken in a low monotone, his gaze fixed on a crack in the plaster wall just over her shoulder. Ilara's own voice was a barely audible whisper, the words catching in her dry throat. She felt a profound sense of disassociation, as if she were floating near the ceiling, watching this strange, sad scene unfold for some other woman. "The ring," the preacher prompted. Caleb produced a simple, unadorned iron ring. He took her right hand, his calloused fingers rough against her skin, and slid the ring onto her finger. She flinched at the cold touch of the metal, and her left hand, the gloved one, instinctively clenched into a tight fist at her side. The transaction was complete. She was now Mrs. Thorne. The ride back to the ranch was blanketed in the same suffocating silence, but now it was heavier, charged with the unspoken expectations of the coming night. The iron ring on her finger felt like a manacle. Dinner was a tense, quiet affair. She had found potatoes, onions, and some salted beef in the pantry and had made a simple stew. She served him a bowl, her hands trembling slightly. He ate without complaint, but also without a word of praise. He ate the way he did everything else, with a grim, joyless efficiency. As they ate, the sun bled out across the horizon, painting the western sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The cabin descended into shadow, the world shrinking to the small, flickering circle of light cast by the single kerosene lamp on the table. The oppressive silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of their own breathing and the scrape of spoons against earthenware bowls. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She was terrified. It was a familiar terror, but with a new edge. Her past had taught her what to expect from men in the dark, but it was not the physical act itself that she feared most. It was the intimacy, the exposure. It was the terror of being seen, truly seen, without her defenses. Her past had taught her that intimacy was not an act of union, but a weapon used against her, a tool for ownership and control. Caleb pushed his empty bowl away and finally broke the silence. "It's late," he said, his voice rough in the quiet room. He stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. He moved towards the bedroom, his shadow looming large and distorted on the log walls. Ilara remained frozen at the table, her hands clenched together in her lap, the fabric of her dress damp with sweat. He paused at the doorway and looked back at her. In the flickering lamplight, his expression was unreadable, a mask of shadows and hard lines. "Are you coming?" It was not a question. It was a quiet command. The bedroom was even colder than the main room, stark and barren. Caleb turned his back to her and began to unbutton his shirt. There was a hesitation in his movements, an awkwardness, as if he too were unaccustomed to this, a stranger to the rituals of a shared bed. Ilara stood by the door, a statue carved from fear. She knew what was expected of her. She knew her duty. With fingers that felt like clumsy, disconnected things, she reached behind her back and began to unlace her simple dress. The rustle of the fabric was a sound as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. Caleb turned, his shirt half open, and his eyes fell upon her. He saw her fear. He saw the violent tremor in her hands as she struggled with the laces. A flicker of something, pity, frustration, crossed his hard features. He stopped, his own hands falling to his sides. He took a hesitant step towards her. "Here," he said, his voice softer than she had yet heard it. He reached for her, his large, calloused hand intending to help her with a difficult button at her collar. His fingers, rough and warm, brushed against her left hand, the one covered by the pristine white glove. It was a stark contrast to her work-worn right hand, which was chapped and red from preparing their meal. His brow furrowed in a flicker of curiosity. He had noticed her insistence on wearing it. Of course, she had not removed it since the moment she arrived, not even while kneading dough for bread that morning. He had assumed it was a strange bit of city modesty, nothing more. Gently, but with an undeniable firmness, he took her wrist. His touch was not violent, but it was unyielding. He meant only to move her hand out of the way. But for Ilara, the touch was a lit fuse. All the terror she had kept bottled inside her, all the dark memories she had fought to suppress, erupted in a silent, screaming wave. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking, barely a sound at all. She tried to pull her hand away, but his grip, gentle as it was like iron. "Please," she begged, her voice rising now, threaded with a raw and desperate panic she could no longer contain. Tears she hadn't known were there sprang to her eyes, blurring his face into a shadowy form. "Please, don't pull it." Her entire body was trembling, a violent, uncontrollable shudder. The plea was so absolute, so filled with a universe of pain and a history of horror, that it stopped him cold. The rancher froze. His hand was still on her wrist, but his grip went slack. He looked down at the pristine white glove, an object of strange and sudden significance, and then up at her terrified, tear-streaked face. He had seen fear in his life. He had seen it in the eyes of a cornered animal, in the faces of men facing death during a cattle stampede. But this was different. This was not the fear of a moment's pain or danger. This was a soul-deep terror, a fear that lived in the marrow of her bones. Unbidden, a ghost of a memory rose in his mind. His first wife, Mary, her gentle touch, the sound of her laughter filling this very room. He had buried those memories deep, walled them off with grief and hard labor until he could no longer feel them. He had shut himself off from all feeling. But Ilara's raw, broken plea pierced through his carefully constructed armor of indifference. His simple curiosity twisted into a dawning, dreadful understanding that this was more than modesty, more than a lady's peculiar habit. This was a secret, one she guarded with the terror of a hunted creature. Slowly, deliberately, he released his grip. His hand fell away. But his gaze remained fixed on her gloved hand. The silence in the room now thick and crackling with the weight of her revealed secret, a secret he had not yet seen, but one whose immense, tragic burden he could suddenly, inexplicably, feel. The air vibrated with tension, with her raw fear, and with a single, unexpected spark of human connection in his moment of stunned hesitation. The aftermath of Ilara's desperate plea was not an explosion, but a deep and chilling silence. After Caleb released her wrist, he did not speak. He simply turned away from her, a solid wall of muscle and shadow, finished unbuttoning his shirt, and lay down on his side of the bed. He kept his back to her, leaving a chasm of empty mattress between them that felt as wide and impassable as the plains outside. Ilara did not move for a long time. She stood frozen, her heart a wild, panicked drum against her ribs. Eventually, the cold of the room seeped into her bones, and she mechanically slipped out of her dress, letting it fall in a heap at her feet. Still in her chemise and petticoats, she crept to the bed and lay down on the very edge of the mattress, as far from him as she could get. She did not sleep. The entire night was a long, dark vigil, spent huddled into a tight ball, her gloved left hand tucked protectively against her chest as if shielding her heart. She listened to the sound of his slow, even breathing, and waited for the dawn, certain it would bring her banishment. She rose before the first hint of gray light touched the sky, her movements as silent as a ghost. In the main room, she stoked the embers in the hearth and prepared breakfast with a desperate, focused energy. The clinking of the cast-iron skillet on the stove, the sharp sizzle of bacon hitting the hot grease, the scrape of a knife on the cutting board, each sound was unnaturally loud in the thick, unspoken tension that filled the cabin. When Caleb entered the kitchen, he did not look at her directly. His gaze went to the fire, to the coffee pot, to the window, anywhere but her face. He moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness, as if the air itself were thick as mud. He sat at the table, and she served him, her hands steady only through a supreme act of will. They ate in complete and utter silence. The unspoken question about the glove, about her terror, hung between them like a physical object, a specter at their wedding breakfast. Ilara braced herself for the inevitable. She expected anger, a cold fury at her deception. She expected disgust, the revulsion of a decent man discovering he had bound himself to damaged goods. At the very least. She expected him to demand she pack her single bag and wait for the next stagecoach, sending her back to whatever hell she had crawled out of. Instead, there was nothing, only a heavy, watchful stillness from him that was almost more unnerving than rage. He ate his meal, drank his coffee, and when he was finished, he stood, took his hat from a peg by the door, and left without a single word. She watched through the window as he headed toward a distant pasture, a length of fencing wire coiled over his shoulder. He was leaving, for now. The physical labor was Caleb's escape, the only way he knew to process a world that had become complicated and sharp-edged. The rhythmic work of stretching wire, of driving staples into fence posts with a heavy hammer, allowed him to wrestle with the turmoil in his mind. He was a man of simple, stark principles. He had made a bargain. He had paid for a wife, a helpmeet, a woman to warm his bed and fill the crushing emptiness of his house. The bargain implied a certain wholeness, an uncomplicated transaction. He felt cheated. But her terror had not been an act. In a life that had become a study in numb endurance, Ilara's raw animal fear was the most genuine thing he had witnessed in years. He found himself replaying the scene in the bedroom over and over, the violent trembling of her body, the raw, broken plea in her voice. It was a sound that scraped at the calloused shell he had built around his heart. It dredged up memories he kept buried deep, memories of his late wife, Mary, and their infant son, Daniel. He remembered the helplessness of watching the fever consume them, their vibrant lives fading to shallow breaths in the space of a single week 3 years prior. He had failed to protect them. The doctor had come too late, his remedies useless. Caleb had been left with nothing but a profound, crushing guilt and the conviction that he was a man destined to fail those he was meant to protect. His grief had become a shroud, making him hard, unfeeling, because feeling was a weakness he could not afford. Ilara's vulnerability had, against his will, found a crack in that armor. He wrestled with the hard prejudices of the world he knew, the whispers he'd heard in redemption. A damaged woman was a worthless woman, trouble waiting to happen. His practical side, the side that had made this loveless bargain, told him to cast her out, to cut his losses and return to his solitude. But another part of him, a part he thought long dead, felt a burgeoning sense of a duty that went far beyond their simple contract. He could not, he was beginning to realize, abandon someone so clearly and profoundly haunted. Back at the cabin, Ilara lived on a knife's edge of anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind whistling around the eaves of the cabin made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. She threw herself into her chores with a frantic, desperate energy. She scrubbed floors that were already clean. She baked bread until the small cabin was filled with its warm, yeasty scent. She fetched water and tended the small, struggling vegetable garden behind the house. She was trying to prove her worth, to make herself so useful, so indispensable, that he would not send her away. She was working to earn her place, not as a wife, but as a hired hand who happened to share his name. While on her knees in the garden, her fingers digging into the dry soil to pull at stubborn weeds. She paused, her back aching. She sat back on her heels and looked out at the vast, silent landscape. The sheer, overwhelming scale of it was both terrifying and strangely comforting. The sky was an immense, empty bowl of blue, the land a rolling sea of grass that stretched to the end of the world. Out here, the sins and sorrows of the city, the grime and the cruelty, seemed distant and insignificant. For the first time, a tiny, fragile glimmer of hope flickered within her. Perhaps she could disappear here. Perhaps, in this great emptiness, she could become someone new, someone without a past. The hope was immediately followed by the crushing weight of her secret. She glanced down at her gloved hand, a stark white shape against the dark earth. Beneath the clean cotton was the one part of her past that could never be erased, a permanent reminder that she could never truly escape what she was, who she had belonged to. Weeks passed in this state of armed truce. They developed a silent routine, a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. They rose before the sun, ate their meals without speaking, and worked in their separate spheres, he on the far-flung tasks of the ranch, she in the confined world of the cabin and its immediate surroundings. At night, they lay in the same bed, a canyon of unspoken tension and unanswered questions between them. She continued to wear the glove at all times, even when her hands were deep in soapy water or flour, and Caleb, after that first night, never again tried to breach the topic. He simply watched her with those cold, gray, assessing eyes. Yet, in the midst of this profound silence, small things began to shift. One morning, Ilara opened the cabin door to find a full bucket of fresh, clean water from the well sitting on the porch, saving her the heavy work of drawing it herself. A few days later, while mending his clothes, she found a tear in his favorite work shirt, the one worn soft with years of use. She took her time, using a fine, neat stitch that made the repair almost invisible. When he wore the shirt next, he ran his thumb over the mended spot, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. They were tiny, unspoken gestures of consideration, the first, fragile threads of a connection being woven in the silence. A significant turning point came with the weather. The sky, which had been a placid blue for weeks, began to curdle, turning a bruised, ominous purple-black in the late afternoon. A violent thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, and the world dissolved into a fury of wind and water. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets, and the thunder was a deafening cannonade that shook the very foundations of the cabin. A bolt of lightning, jagged and brilliant, struck a tall cottonwood tree near the barn. The crack was instantaneous and explosive. One of Caleb's prized horses, a powerful roan gelding, spooked by the thunder and the flash of fire, reared up in its corral. With a scream of terror, it splintered the top rail of the fence and bolted, disappearing into the raging storm. Without a second's hesitation, Caleb grabbed a bridle and ran towards his other horse. Ilara, watching from the window, saw the reckless determination in his eyes. That horse was worth a small fortune, a significant part of his livelihood. "Wait!" she screamed, her voice lost in the roar of the wind. "It is not safe!" He ignored her, his jaw set in a grim, determined line as he threw a saddle on his remaining horse, fearing for his safety more than she feared the storm. Ilara pulled on a heavy oilskin coat that hung by the door and ran out after him, a swinging lantern her only weapon against the tumultuous dark. She found him not far from the homestead, in a shallow gully where the runaway horse had come to a stop. It had gashed its leg badly on the broken fence, a deep, bleeding wound. The animal was wild-eyed with pain and terror, kicking out viciously whenever Caleb tried to get near it. "Whoa now, easy boy," Caleb grunted, trying to dodge a flailing hoof. Ilara stopped a short distance away, using a gentle, calming voice she did not know she possessed, a voice she had perhaps learned from a lifetime of soothing, frightened things, including herself. She began to speak to the animal. "Easy now," she murmured, her tone low and steady. "It is all right. You are safe now. Easy, boy." She approached slowly, her movements small and non-threatening, the lantern held low. The horse, still trembling violently, seemed to respond to the softness in her tone. Its ears, which had been pinned back in fear, twitched and swiveled towards her, working together, with Ilara murmuring a constant, soothing stream of words while Caleb used his strength and knowledge of the animal. They managed to get a rope around its neck. Slowly, painstakingly, they led the limping, terrified horse back to the relative safety of the barn. Inside, the storm raged, a wild symphony of wind and rain against the wooden walls. They worked by the golden, swaying light of the single lantern to tend to the horse's deep wound. Caleb inspected the gash, his expression grim. It needed to be cleaned and sealed, or the horse would be lost. He went to the small forge he kept in the corner and began to prepare a hot iron to cauterize the gash, a brutal but necessary procedure on the frontier. The horse was still panicked, its flanks slick with sweat and rain. Ilara, seeing the terror in the animal's large, dark eyes, felt a pang of profound empathy. She forgot herself for a moment. She forgot her own fear, her own carefully constructed walls. She instinctively reached out to stroke its neck, to offer what comfort she could. Her left hand, the gloved one, came to rest on the horse's trembling hide. Caleb looked up from the glowing iron and saw the gesture. He saw the genuine, unfeigned empathy in her eyes, the natural, fearless way she was comforting the panicked creature. In that moment, for the first time, he saw not a damaged woman or a mail-order bride he had purchased. He saw a person of immense kindness and quiet, unassuming strength. As he approached with the hot iron, the horse smelled the searing heat and screamed. Rearing up in the narrow stall, it knocked the lantern from its hook, plunging the barn into a terrifying, near-total darkness, lit only by the faint, residual red glow of the iron in Caleb's hand. Ilara was thrown against the rough-hewn wall of the stall. In the chaos, the cuff of her glove was snagged on a protruding nail and, with a sharp rip, the glove was torn from her hand, landing somewhere in the scattered hay. Caleb dropped the iron and rushed to her side, his hands finding her in the dark. "Are you all right?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice was filled not with duty or practicality, but with genuine, urgent concern. He helped her to her feet, his hands steadying her. In the dim, red glow from the cooling iron, he saw her left hand, which she was instinctively trying to hide, and then he saw it. There, seared into the delicate skin of her palm, was a brand. It was not a simple letter or a crude mark. It was an ornate, stylized, the kind of elaborate brand a wealthy man might use on his finest livestock, a mark of absolute ownership. The secret was out. The air in the dark barn became electric, charged with the sudden, terrible revelation. Ilara scrambled to cover her exposed hand with her other, a choked sob escaping her lips. Shame and terror contorted her features. She expected revulsion. She expected condemnation. She expected him to finally cast her out. Caleb stared at the brand, the symbol of her horrific past finally revealed. All the pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality, her constant fear, the ever-present glove, her desperate, broken plea on their wedding night. A wave of cold, silent fury washed over him, a rage so profound it felt like ice in his veins. But it was not directed at her. It was directed at the unknown person, the monster, who could do such a thing to another human being. He looked from the obscene mark on her palm to her terrified, tear-streaked face, illuminated in the faint, dying glow of the iron, and in that moment, shared in the dark heart of the storm, his internal conflict resolved itself. He did not see a harlot or a fallen woman. He did not see damaged goods. He saw a survivor. Slowly, so as not to frighten her further, he reached out. He did not grab or inspect. He gently, tenderly, took her hand. He turned it over, his calloused thumb brushing with an impossible softness against the scarred, raised edges of the brand. He said nothing, but his touch was not one of judgment or disgust. It was a touch of acceptance, of a shared and understood pain. In the dark, storm-swept barn, it was the beginning of something more than a bargain, more than an alliance. The walk back from the barn was a journey through a world transformed. The storm had broken, and a fragile dawn was seeping over the horizon, painting the bruised clouds in pale shades of rose and gray. The air was washed clean, smelling of wet earth and sage. The silence between them was no longer the cold, empty silence of their first days together, but a new kind of quiet, heavy and profound, charged with the weight of a secret finally brought into the light. Back in the cabin, Ilara felt the walls closing in. She was coiled with a shame so deep it was a physical sickness. She waited for the verdict she was certain must come. Now that the full, ugly truth of her past was exposed, she was branded, property, a thing, not a person. She huddled in a chair by the cold hearth, her arms wrapped around herself, her newly bare hand tucked out of sight, and waited. Caleb, however, was a man changed. The wall of stoic indifference he had so carefully constructed around himself had not just been breached, it had been shattered. He moved about the small cabin with a new, deliberate purpose. He stoked the fire, his movements sure and steady. He filled the coffee pot and set it on the stove, the familiar, comforting aroma slowly filling the tense air. He did not look at her with judgment or disgust. He looked at her as if seeing her for the very first time. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 cups and placed one on the small table in front of her. His hand was steady. He sat down opposite her, the table a small island in the sea of their shared silence. For a long time, he just looked at his cup, the steam rising to wreath his grim face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and devoid of the slightest trace of condemnation. "Who was this?" he asked. The question was direct, yet gentle. It was not an accusation. It was not a demand for the sordid details. It was an invitation, a quiet request for the story that belonged to the scar. This simple act of seeing her as a person with a story rather than an object with a defect was so unexpected, so profoundly decent, that it was transformative for Ilara. It was the first crack of light in her own long, dark night. Tears she thought she had no more of welled in her eyes and slipped down her cheeks, hesitantly, in a voice thick with shame and a sorrow so old it felt like part of her bones. She began to tell him. She did not share all the horrifying details. She could not bear to give them voice, but she gave him the shape of it, the stark and ugly truth. She spoke of a man named Silas Blackwood, a powerful and cruel man in the city where she had grown up. He was a man of wealth and taste, who kept a beautiful house filled with beautiful women. He did not call it a brothel. He called it his collection. Ilara had been sold to him as a young girl, a debt her desperate family could not pay. She had become one of his possessions. The brand, she explained, her voice dropping to a near whisper, was his ultimate mark of ownership. It was reserved for his favorites, the ones he believed he would own forever. It was a permanent reminder to her, and to anyone else who might see it, of her station. She was his property, marked and recorded as surely as the cattle in his fields. She told him how she had escaped. A fire had swept through the city's warehouse district, the chaos and confusion a perfect cover. In the smoke and panic, she had simply walked away, disappearing into the terrified crowds. She had found his advertisement for a bride in a discarded newspaper, and it had seemed like a message from God himself, her only hope of ever being truly free, of finding a place so remote that Silas's shadow could not reach her. As she spoke, Caleb listened without interruption. His startlingly gray eyes never left her face, and his expression was grim, a mask of cold, hard anger that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. He was a man who understood the simple brutality of the world. But this was something else. This was a calculated, possessive evil that went beyond mere hardship. He was realizing the true depth of the darkness she had fled, and a silent, lethal rage began to build within him. When she finished, the silence returned, but it was a shared silence now. In the fragile light of the new day, this shared confidence forged a new and powerful intimacy between them, something more real and binding than any physical act could ever have been. Life on the ranch changed. The suffocating silence that had defined their existence was replaced by a tentative companionship. They began to talk. At first, it was about the ranch, the state of the fences, the health of the horses, the coming change in the weather. These small, practical conversations were bridges built across the chasm that had separated them. Gradually, the topics drifted toward more personal things. One evening, sitting by the fire, Caleb began to speak of his own past. He told her about his first wife, Mary, and their infant son, Daniel. He spoke of her laughter, of the way she had filled this empty cabin with light. And then he told her how the fever had taken them both, his voice flat and heavy with a grief that was still raw. They had died within a week of each other, his son in his arms, his wife's hand in his. He spoke of his own terrible guilt, his feeling of utter helplessness as he watched them die, powerless to stop it. "I was meant to protect them," he said, his gaze lost in the flames. "A man is supposed to protect his family. I failed." In that moment, Ilara finally understood him. His coldness was not a lack of feeling, but a shield for a grief so profound he feared it would swallow him whole. His distance was a fortress built to protect a heart that had already been shattered once. They were two deeply wounded people, their souls scarred by different kinds of violence, finding a strange and unexpected solace in each other's damaged landscapes. The harsh Wyoming wilderness, once a symbol of her isolation, was slowly becoming a shared space where they could begin to heal. Their emotional connection, forged in the heat of revelation and tempered by shared grief, began to deepen into a physical one. It started not with a demand, but with small, tentative touches that were questions in themselves. His hand brushed hers as he passed her a tool while they repaired the storm-damaged corral. Her fingers lingered for a fraction of a second on his shoulder as she placed a plate of food before him at dinner. Each touch was a spark, an acknowledgement of the desire that had been simmering beneath the surface, a desire long complicated by fear and grief. One evening, after a long, exhausting day spent working together to round up a few stray cattle, they stood on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset. Unlike the violent, bloody sunsets of her first days there, this one was a masterpiece of peace. The sky was ablaze with soft colors, rose, gold, and a deep, gentle violet. The air was still and cool. Caleb turned to her. In the golden light, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. This time, when he reached for her, she did not flinch. His calloused fingers touched her cheek with a reverence that made her breath catch in her throat. He finally lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the kiss of a man claiming his marital rights. It was not an act of ownership or demand. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a gentle question, a gesture of both asking and receiving. When she responded, her own fears melting away in the face of his unexpected gentleness, the kiss deepened into something more. Their lovemaking that night was a slow, quiet discovery. It was an act of healing and reclamation for both of them, for Ilara, after a lifetime of intimacy being a weapon used against her. It was the first time it was not about pain or submission, but about shared vulnerability, about a trust she never thought she would feel. For Caleb, it was the first time he had allowed himself to feel a true, deep connection since Mary's death, the first time he had let another soul into the fortress of his grief. A period of fragile, hard-won peace settled over the Thorn Ranch. They fell into the comfortable, synchronized rhythm of a real marriage. They worked side by side, mending the last of the fences, tending the garden, their movements communicating more than words ever could. Laughter, a sound long absent from the log cabin, began to echo within its walls, a soft sound at first, then more frequent, more confident. One afternoon, Ilara, while cleaning, took the single white glove she had kept tucked away in a drawer. She walked to the fireplace, where Caleb was mending a bridle, and without a word, dropped it into the flames. They watched together as the symbol of her shame and fear curled, blackened, and turned to ash. From that day on, she never tried to hide her hand inside the house. The brand was still there, a pale, silvery scar against her skin, but it was no longer a mark of shame that had to be hidden at all costs. It was simply a part of her story, a story Caleb now shared. He watched her, truly saw her, and found himself falling deeply in love. It was a love that felt different from what he had shared with Mary. That had been a love of youthful innocence, of shared beginnings. This was something quieter, deeper, forged in hardship and built on a profound, abiding respect for the survivor she was, for her strength, her resilience, her impossible capacity for joy despite everything she had endured. This idyllic peace was shattered on a bright autumn day during a trip to the town of Redemption for supplies. Ilara, feeling more confident and at ease in her new life, had accompanied Caleb. While he went into the general store to conduct his business, She waited outside on the buckboard, enjoying the warmth of the sun on her face. A man dismounted from a fine-looking horse in front of the saloon. He was slick and well-dressed, a stark contrast to the dusty ranchers and townsfolk, and there was something unsettlingly familiar in his cold, watchful eyes. His gaze swept the street and then locked onto her. His face registered a moment of shock, which was quickly replaced by a slow, predatory smile. "I'll be damned," he said, his voice smooth and menacing as he crossed the dusty street toward her. "Little Sparrow, Silas has been looking for you. He's offered a handsome reward for his lost property." Ilara froze, the blood draining from her face, the warm sun turning to ice on her skin. The man was one of Silas's enforcers, a cruel man named Finn. The past she thought she had finally outrun had just caught up to her with a terrifying suddenness. Panic seized her. She turned to flee, to jump from the wagon and run, but he was too fast. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. At that exact moment, Caleb emerged from the general store, a sack of flour over his shoulder. He took in the scene in a single, lightning-fast glance, the well-dressed stranger's hand on his wife, the pure, abject terror on her face. He dropped the sack in the dust, in 2 long, silent strides. He was there, his own hand clamping down on Finn's wrist like a blacksmith's vice. "Get your hand off my wife!" Caleb's voice was dangerously low, a growl rumbling deep in his chest. The confrontation drew the immediate attention of the entire street. Men stopped their conversations. Women paused on the boardwalk. Finn, arrogant and overconfident in the power of the man he worked for, merely sneered, trying to wrench his wrist free from Caleb's unbreakable grip. "This woman is stolen property," Finn spat, his eyes full of malice. "She belongs to Mr. Silas Blackwood." He gave a vicious yank on Ilara's arm, pulling her left hand forward, trying to expose the palm for all to see. "She's one of his, marked and paid for." The whispers started immediately, a low hiss that spread through the watching crowd. Stares that had once been suspicious now turned to a roar of judgment. The sheriff, who had witnessed their wedding, came out onto the porch of his office, his face a mask of conflict and discomfort. The social prejudice that had always simmered just beneath the surface now boiled over. In an instant, Ilara was no longer Mrs. Thorne, the quiet rancher's wife. She was a branded woman, a harlot, a piece of someone else's property. Caleb's response was swift and decisive. He did not argue. He did not explain or plead his case. He released Finn's wrist and landed a single, brutal punch that sent the man sprawling backward into the dust. He then stood over the gasping man, his body a formidable shield in front of Ilara. He turned his cold, gray eyes on the silent, watching crowd. "This is my wife, Ilara Thorne," he announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority that cut through the whispers. "Anyone who says otherwise will answer to me." He turned his back on the town, on Finn, who was sputtering threats and curses from the dirt, and gently helped a trembling Ilara back onto the wagon seat. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and turned the horses around, heading back to the ranch. The fragile peace they had built was shattered. They were no longer just a couple building a life. They were fugitives in their own home. As they rode away from redemption, leaving the town buzzing with scandal, a new and terrible silence descended. The threat was no longer a memory. It was real, and it was coming for them. The ride back from redemption was a journey into a new and terrifying kind of silence. It was not the empty, awkward silence of their first days, but a thick, suffocating vacuum filled with the ghosts of the life they had briefly known. Ilara sat rigid on the wagon seat, her body catatonic with a fear so profound it had frozen her from the inside out. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at the passing landscape. But she saw nothing. The fragile peace, the impossible hope that had begun to bloom in her heart, had been utterly destroyed, ripped out by the roots. Her mind was a maelstrom of self-loathing and despair. She had brought this ruin upon Caleb. She was a plague, a carrier of a pestilence from her past that would now consume everything good and decent she had touched. The whispers of the townspeople, the sneer on Finn's face, echoed in her head. Tainted property. That is what they saw. And now, surely, that is what Caleb would see too. The gentle, healing love he had shown her would curdle into disgust and regret. He had bargained for a wife, and he had received a curse. Caleb, too, was silent. But his was not the cold, distant quiet of a man retreating into himself. It was the focused, grim silence of a man preparing for war. His hands gripped the leather reins so tightly that his knuckles were white bone beneath the sun-darkened skin. His jaw was a hard line, his gaze sweeping the horizon not with a rancher's idle observance, but with a soldier's tactical assessment. He was consumed by a protective fury so intense it was a physical force, a palpable heat radiating from him. The tentative, healing love he had discovered for Ilara had, in the crucible of that public confrontation, solidified into an unshakable, granite-hard resolve. He had failed to protect his family once. He would not lose another. When they reached the homestead, the reality of their isolation, which had once been a source of healing and peace, became a terrifying vulnerability. They were miles from any help, miles from the town that had already judged and condemned them. They were an island in a vast, empty sea of grass, a sea that could hide an approaching enemy until it was too late. Caleb did not hesitate. He pulled the wagon to a halt, helped a still trembling Ilara down, and immediately began to fortify the cabin. He was methodical, his actions precise and economical, born of a grim familiarity with violence that was part of life on the frontier. He took heavy iron bars he used for mending equipment and wedged them across the insides of the window shutters. He used his hammer and thick nails to reinforce the crossbeam of the main door. He worked with a silent, grim focus that was both terrifying and strangely reassuring to watch. He went to a large, locked chest in the corner of the bedroom, a chest she had never seen him open, and took out his weapons. A long Winchester rifle, its wood stock worn smooth with use, a heavy double-barreled shotgun, and a Colt revolver in a worn leather holster. He checked each weapon with an expert's touch, laying out cartridges on the table, the brass casings glinting in the lamplight. He picked up the shotgun. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He brought the weapon to her, and the feel of the cold, heavy steel in her hands was horrifying. It was an object of pure, brutal function. He stood behind her, his large, calloused hands guiding hers, showing her how to break it open, how to load the heavy brass shells, how to cock the hammers. His body was a solid wall at her back, his breath warm against her ear as he spoke in low, clipped tones. "You point it, you pull the trigger, do not hesitate." The weight of the gun was the weight of an impossible choice, but as her fingers traced the cold, hard lines of the trigger guard, a tiny ember of defiance sparked to life within the overwhelming sea of her fear. She would not be dragged back. She would not be a piece of property reclaimed. She would not be a victim again. As they worked together in the tense, lamplit cabin, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the darkness, the emotional dam that had stood between them broke completely. The carefully constructed walls they had both hidden behind crumbled under the immense pressure of their shared peril. Caleb, seeing the silent despair in her eyes, the way she flinched at every gust of wind, finally gave voice to the ghosts that haunted him. He told her the full story of his wife and child's death. It was not just the fact of the fever, but the harrowing, soul-crushing details. He spoke of the endless nights sitting by their beds, the scent of sickness filling the small room, the feel of Mary's frail, hot hand in his. He described the terrible, rasping sound of his infant son's breathing, the utter powerlessness he felt as he watched the life fade from them, leaving him behind in a world that had become silent and gray. "I should have done something," he confessed, his voice thick with a guilt that had festered for 3 years. "A doctor, a different medicine, anything. I just sat there and watched them die. I closed myself off from the world because I had failed. I had failed as a husband, as a father. I had failed as a protector." His raw, painful confession unlocked her own. His vulnerability was a key that turned the lock on the darkest rooms of her own past. In a halting, broken voice, her words punctuated by shudders she could not control, Ilara told him everything. She told him about Silas Blackwood, not just as a cruel man, but as a master of the soul's slow destruction. She described the gilded cage of the house, where every luxury was a link in a chain, every kindness a tool of manipulation. She spoke of the psychological torture, the way Silas delighted in finding a woman's deepest fear and using it to break her spirit, to make her utterly dependent on him. Finally, she told him about the night of the branding. She described the smell of whiskey and cigar smoke in the room, the other men watching, the chillingly calm look in Silas's eyes as he heated the iron in the fire. She spoke of the searing, white-hot pain, a pain that went beyond the flesh and seemed to burn her very soul. She described the stench of her own burning skin and the utter, absolute dehumanization of being marked like an animal, her identity erased and replaced by his initial. "He believes he owns me," she whispered, the words tasting like poison. "Not just my body. He believes he owns my thoughts, my will. He told me that wherever I went, I would still belong to him." As she spoke, Caleb's simmering rage cooled into something far more dangerous. It became a lethal, razor-sharp focus. The hot anger he had felt toward Finn in the street was a simple, animal thing. This was different. He now understood that he was not just fighting a man who wanted a woman back. He was fighting a manifestation of pure evil, a man who fed on the destruction of others. In that moment, they were no longer just a rancher and his mail-order bride. They were two survivors, their individual traumas merging, twisting together into a single, shared cause. The siege began at dusk. They appeared as 5 dark shapes on the ridge against the blood-red sunset. Silas, Finn, and 3 other hired thugs. They did not storm the cabin immediately. Silas was a man who savored cruelty, who preferred to let fear do his work for him. They circled the cabin on horseback, their figures silhouetted against the dying light, a silent, menacing patrol. Then, Silas's voice drifted through the darkness. It was smooth, cultured, and utterly chilling. "Sparrow," he called out, the sound carrying easily in the still air. "My little sparrow, did you think you could fly so far? A cage of this size does not suit you. It is time to come home." Ilara flinched as if struck. The pet name, once whispered to her in what she had mistaken for affection, was now a poisoned dart. "I have missed you, my dear," the voice continued, circling, omnipresent. "But you have been a very wicked girl. Your punishment for running will be exquisite. I have had a long time to think about it." Every word was designed to break her, to remind her of her powerlessness, to drag her back into the terror that had been her life. Caleb moved to her side, pulling her away from the window, his presence a solid anchor in the storm of her fear. He held her, his arms a protective circle around her trembling body. "Do not listen to him," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "He is just a man, and he cannot hurt you anymore." The first wave of the attack came deep in the night. An orange glow flickered to life in the darkness. They had set the barn on fire, hoping to draw Caleb out into the open. Gunfire erupted. The terrifying crack of rifles and the whine of ricocheting bullets filled the night. Wood splintered near the window as a shot went wide. Caleb, positioned at a small, shuttered opening, was a figure of calm, deadly focus. He raised his Winchester, took a breath, and fired. He worked the lever, ejected the spent cartridge, and fired again. His movements were disciplined, precise, unhurried. He was not a man consumed by rage, but a cold, efficient marksman. An answering cry of pain from the darkness told them a shot had found its mark. After another volley of fire, the attackers retreated, melting back into the shadows. Ilara, huddled on the floor beside him, reloaded the spare rifle, her hands clumsy with fear but her movements steady. She slid the cartridges into the gate, her mind focused on the simple, mechanical task. In the crucible of the attack, they had become a team, moving and acting as one. The intense, overwhelming fear was a strange intoxicant, stripping away all pretense, all doubt, leaving only raw, desperate instinct. During the lull in the fighting that followed, they were trapped in the dark and dangerous intimacy of the cabin. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the tension of what was yet to come. They both knew they might not survive until dawn. This shared, imminent mortality ignited a desperate, fierce passion between them. It was a raw, almost violent need to affirm life in the face of death. He came to her in the darkness, and she met him with a frantic, clinging intensity. This was not the gentle, healing tenderness of before. This was an act of love and defiance, a furious statement against the darkness that surrounded them. They came together with a promise, unspoken but perfectly understood. If they were to die, they would die together, belonging only to each other, their souls forever intertwined and free. As the first pale hint of dawn threatened to break the eastern horizon, Silas grew impatient. They launched a final, direct assault on the cabin. The heavy, rhythmic thud of a battering ram, a thick log, began to hammer against the reinforced door. Finn and another man were at the log, their grunts of effort audible between the splintering crashes. Caleb fired the Winchester through a crack in the wall, and one of the men screamed and fell away. But the assault on the door continued. At the same time, Ilara saw a dark shape at the shattered window. Another man was trying to climb through. Terror, cold and absolute, seized her. But then came the rage. Rage at Silas, at this man, at the years of fear. She remembered Caleb's instructions. She scrambled for the heavy shotgun. Her hands were shaking, tears of terror and fury streaming down her face. She lifted the heavy weapon, pointed the twin barrels at the shape in the window, and pulled both triggers. The recoil was a physical blow, throwing her backward onto the floor, her shoulders screaming in protest. But the deafening blast found its mark. The man at the window was thrown violently back out into the darkness. She had done it. She had taken a life to defend her own. It was a terrifying and transformative act. At that moment, the cabin door, battered and broken, finally splintered and gave way. Silas Blackwood, his handsome face contorted in a mask of pure fury, stood framed in the ruined doorway. A pistol was held tight in his hand. The wounded Finn was right behind him, a dark shape limping in the growing light. Caleb stood to face him in the center of the room, his own Colt revolver raised and steady. Ilara was on the floor, the empty shotgun hot beside her, her hands scrambling for more shells. The cabin was a scene of carnage, filled with swirling gun smoke and the metallic smell of blood and gunpowder. The final confrontation, the reckoning for which they had been preparing all night, had arrived. It was Silas versus Caleb, the monster from her past against the protector of her present, with her life and her very soul as the prize. For a long, heart-stopping moment, the world was a frozen tableau in the ruined doorway of the cabin. The air, thick with gun smoke, held them all suspended. Silas, his handsome face a mask of cold fury. Caleb, a statue of protective defiance, his revolver steady, and Ilara on the floor, a desperate survivor amidst the wreckage. Silas's cold, arrogant eyes locked with Caleb's blazing, protective ones. "You have cost me a great deal of time and money, rancher," Silas said, his voice dangerously calm, the cultured tones a jarring dissonance in the scene of brutal carnage. "Step aside. I have come for what is mine." He gestured with the barrel of his pistol toward Ilara, who was still fumbling with the heavy shotgun shells, her fingers slick with sweat. The possessiveness in his voice, the utter, unshakable conviction that Ilara was an object to be reclaimed, a ledger to be balanced, made Caleb's blood run cold. "She belongs to no one but herself," Caleb said, his own voice miraculously steady despite the adrenaline that was a roaring fire in his veins. "And she is my wife. You will leave this place now, or you will be carried from it." The standoff, held in place by the sheer force of two opposing wills, exploded into violence. Finn, the wounded enforcer flanking Silas, saw an opening and lunged into the room, a knife appearing in his good hand. Caleb's revolver barked. The shot aimed true for Silas's heart. But in that split second, Finn's lunge carried him into the bullet's path. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain and shock as the bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. In that fatal moment of distraction, Silas fired. The world seemed to slow down. Ilara saw the orange flash from his pistol, saw Caleb's body jolt as if struck by lightning. The bullet ripped through Caleb's side, a searing line of fire that made him grunt, a deep, animal sound of pain. He staggered back a step, his left hand instinctively clamping over the wound. Blood, shockingly dark, instantly soaked his shirt, spreading like a fatal bloom. "Caleb!" Ilara screamed his name, a sound of pure, soul-deep agony that was torn from the very center of her being. Seeing Caleb injured, a cruel, triumphant smile twisted Silas's lips. He stepped disdainfully over the groaning form of Finn and advanced on Ilara, his shadow falling over her. He was the monster from her nightmares, made real in the morning light. "Now, Sparrow," he said softly, his voice a venomous caress as he reached for her. "Time to come home." That single word, home, a word that should have meant safety and warmth but to her meant only terror and violation, ignited the last of her defiance. The fear was still there, a cold, slick serpent in her gut, but it was now overwhelmed by a primal, towering rage. This man had hurt Caleb. He had invaded their sanctuary. He would not take her. He would not win. As his hand reached for her, her trembling fingers finally succeeded. She slammed the shotgun shut, the metallic click a sound of finality, with a guttural scream that was part terror, part fury, a sound that came from a place deeper than words. She raised the barrel and fired from her seated position on the floor. The close-range blast was a deafening, concussive force that filled the small cabin. It hit Silas square in the chest, throwing him violently backward through the doorway as if he were a rag doll. He landed hard in the dirt of the yard, his arrogant expression frozen in a mask of pure shock. For a moment, he stared at the sky, and then his eyes glazed over, becoming dull, empty windows. The monster was dead. A profound silence descended, broken only by Caleb's ragged, painful breathing and Ilara's own desperate, gulping sobs. The immediate threat was gone, but the aftermath was a scene of utter carnage and devastation. 2 of Silas's men lay dead in the yard where Caleb had shot them. The man she had shot lay twisted beneath the window. Finn was groaning and bleeding on the floor. And Silas, the architect of all her pain, lay motionless just outside, his fine clothes stained with dust and blood. The rising sun sent long, golden shafts of light through the bullet-riddled walls of the cabin, illuminating the swirling dust motes that danced in the air. The home they had just begun to build together was shattered, violated, soaked in blood. The shock held her for only a moment. Then she scrambled to Caleb's side. His face was pale, beaded with sweat, and the blood was still seeping between his fingers. The wound was bad. She could see that it was very bad. In that instant, the roles were reversed. He, the strong, silent protector, was wounded and vulnerable. She, the frightened, hunted creature, had to be the strong one. "Caleb," she whispered, her hands hovering over his, not knowing what to do. He grunted, his eyes clouded with pain. "The bed!" He managed to get out. She worked with a desperate focus born of terror and love. She ripped long strips from the hem of her petticoat, the fabric tearing with a sharp, insistent sound. Her hands, now covered in his warm, sticky blood, fumbled to create a makeshift bandage. Her medical knowledge was rudimentary, a collection of grim lessons learned from tending to the other women in Silas's house, women who had been beaten or cut. She folded the cloth into a thick pad and pressed it hard against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. Finn, clutching his own bleeding shoulder, watched her from the floor, his face a mask of fear and disbelief. He saw now that the timid, broken thing he remembered from the city was gone, replaced by this fierce, blood-soaked woman who moved with a terrifying purpose. With an effort that strained every muscle in her body, Ilara helped Caleb to the bed, half carrying, half dragging him. He collapsed onto the mattress, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He was already beginning to burn with fever. The rest of the day was a grim, exhausting ordeal that passed in a blur of numb horror. Ilara's world shrank to the small, bloody space of the cabin. She tended to Caleb, who began to drift in and out of consciousness, his words becoming a jumbled, feverish murmur. Between moments of caring for him, she had to deal with the rest. She went to Finn. He shrank back from her as she approached. She took his pistol and the knife from his belt. Then, using strips of rope she found in a supply box, she bound his good hand securely to his feet. "If you move," she said, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion, "I will use the gun I just killed your boss with. Do you understand me?" He nodded, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. The woman who had been a victim now held the power of life and death, and her utter lack of emotion terrified him more than any threat could have. Then came the hardest part. The bodies. She could not leave them there, with a strength she did not know she possessed. She dragged the man from beneath the window and the other two from the yard, pulling them one by one to the side of the barn. It was a gruesome, physically draining task that left her exhausted, splattered with blood, and feeling profoundly numb. She was operating on pure survival instinct, a part of her mind shut down, allowing her body to perform the impossible tasks before it. She was no longer Ilara, the mail-order bride. She was a soldier in the aftermath of a terrible battle. Justice in the West was a complicated, often brutal affair. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to sink, the town sheriff finally arrived, a dusty posse of 3 men behind him. A distant neighbor, hearing the prolonged sound of gunfire, had ridden to town for help. The sheriff, the same weary man who had witnessed her wedding, dismounted and took in the scene of absolute carnage with a grim, practiced eye. He saw the dead bodies lined up by the barn, the splintered door, the wounded outlaw tied up in the cabin, the half-conscious rancher on the bed, and the woman. He saw the woman, covered in blood and grime, her dress torn, her face a pale, emotionless mask, the heavy shotgun leaning against the wall near her hand. Finn, seeing the law, began to tell his story. A desperate, self-serving tale of righteous property retrieval gone terribly wrong. He painted Silas as a wronged gentleman and Caleb as a violent thief. The sheriff listened patiently, his gaze never leaving Ilara. When Finn was done, the sheriff looked at her. "Ma'am, what is your side of it?" Ilara did not speak. She simply walked over to him and held out her left hand, palm up, revealing the ornate, silvery brand. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She held his gaze, letting the scar tell the story that words could not. The sheriff, a practical man who understood the harsh realities of life on the frontier, looked from the brand on her hand to the number of dead men Silas had brought with him, to the heavily fortified cabin. The evidence told a different story than Finn's. He saw not a murder scene, but the desperate, bloody aftermath of a siege, a defense of home and life against a predator. He nodded slowly. "Looks like self-defense to me," he said, to the quiet assent of his men. They took the wounded, protesting Finn into custody, and helped load the bodies onto a wagon. Before he left, the sheriff paused. "Your husband, ma'am. He needs a doctor. I will send him out as soon as I get back to town." But as the posse rode away, leaving a profound and terrible quiet in their wake, the psychological toll of the violence began to set in. The adrenaline that had sustained Ilara drained away, leaving her hollow and trembling. Caleb's fever worsened. He tossed and turned on the bed, lost in a delirium that carried him back in time. And in his delirium he called out a name. "Mary," he moaned, his hand reaching for Ilara's. "Mary, I am so sorry. I could not save you." The name was a devastating blow, a knife to Ilara's already wounded soul. Even now, after everything they had been through, after they had fought and bled and killed for each other, he was calling for his first wife. In his moment of greatest need, it was Mary he saw, Mary he needed. The fear that had always lurked in the deepest shadows of her heart, the fear that she was just a replacement, a ghost living in another woman's home, another woman's bed, rose up to consume her. She was overwhelmed by guilt guilt for bringing this violence to his door, for shattering the quiet solitude of his life, and a profound, soul-shaking guilt for having taken a human life, even one as evil as Silas's. The weight of it all pressed down on her, and she felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. She sat by Caleb's bedside through the long, dark night, a solitary, weeping sentinel. She kept a cool cloth on his fevered brow. She cleaned his wound as best she could, and she cried, silent tears tracking paths through the grime and blood on her face. The crisis came near dawn. Caleb's fever, which had raged like a wildfire, finally broke. The violent shivering stopped, and a sheen of sweat covered his body. He opened his eyes, and for the first time in hours, they were clear. He saw her, asleep in the chair beside him, her head resting on the edge of his bed, her face stained with tears. He saw the shotgun leaning against the wall, the dried blood on her dress, and he remembered what she had done. He reached out, his hand weak and trembling, and touched her hair. She woke with a start, her eyes wide and full of a raw, haunted pain. "You called for Mary," she whispered, her voice husky with unshed tears. It was not an accusation, but a statement of heartbreaking fact. Caleb looked at her, his gaze full of a deep, weary clarity. He understood the wound his delirious words had inflicted. "Mary is a memory," he said, his voice raspy and weak, but firm. "A ghost. I live with her memory, but she is gone." He tightened his grip on her hand. "You, Ilara, you are the one who is real. You are the one who fought with me. You are the one who saved me." He pulled her hand to his lips, her left hand, the branded one, and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to the scar. In that single, profound moment, he erased her deepest fear. She was not a replacement. She was not a ghost in another woman's life. She was his partner, his savior, his wife. They had survived the reckoning. But as the first light of a new day crept into the ruined cabin, they both knew that the deep, internal wounds were just beginning to show. Their healing would be a longer, harder battle than the one they had just fought and won. The weeks that followed the siege were a quiet, desperate war of another kind. The ranch was a constant, glaring reminder of the violence. Bullet holes scarred the log walls of the cabin like smallpox scars. The barn door, ripped from one of its hinges, hung crooked and forlorn. The physical battle was over, but the fight for healing, both of body and of soul, had just begun. Caleb's recovery was a slow, arduous journey through a valley of shadow. The doctor the sheriff had sent came and went, a grim-faced man who offered little comfort beyond clean bandages and a bottle of laudanum. The bullet wound, angry and deep, became infected. A fever took hold of Caleb, a raging fire that threatened to consume what little strength he had left. For days, his life hung by a fragile, fraying thread. Ilara became his anchor in that storm. She nursed him with an unwavering, almost ferocious devotion. She rarely slept, her exhaustion a heavy cloak she refused to shrug off. She bathed his burning skin with cool water, forced broth and willow bark tea between his cracked lips, and held his hand through the long, dark nights of delirium. She was no longer fighting a monster of flesh and blood, but the invisible specter of death itself, and she would not yield. During this time, the town of Redemption, a place she had come to dread, rendered its verdict. The sheriff, having taken the wounded Finn back to be judged by a circuit court, had corroborated Ilara's story. His official report spoke of a clear case of self-defense against a gang of outlaws. The community, initially so quick to judge and condemn, was now divided. Some still whispered, their faces pinched with suspicion, viewing Ilara as a magnet for trouble, a woman whose past was a dangerous shadow. But many others, particularly the women who knew the bone-deep fear of isolation, and the other ranchers who understood the sacred law of defending one's homestead, saw them differently. They saw a rancher and his wife who had stood their ground against a powerful evil and, against all odds, had won. One morning, Ilara opened the cabin door to find a freshly baked loaf of bread sitting on the porch, still warm and wrapped in a clean dishcloth. A few days later, A jar of blackberry preserves appeared, then a basket of eggs. They were small gifts, left by unseen neighbors in the quiet hours of the dawn, silent tokens of support that spoke louder than any words. Each offering was a stitch, helping to mend the tear that had been ripped between their small homestead and the outside world. As Caleb's fever finally broke and his physical strength began its slow, painful return, it became clear that their emotional wounds remained raw and gaping. He was plagued by nightmares, but they were not of Silas or the gunfight. In his sleep, he was thrust back into the suffocating grip of his deepest trauma, the helplessness of watching the fever take Mary and his infant son. His own brush with death had reawakened the dormant agony of his past. He would cry out in his sleep, his hands reaching for ghosts, and Alara would hold him, her own heart aching, murmuring soft words of comfort until he returned to the present. He was quieter than ever, but his silence was different now. It was not the silence of a fortress, but of a shared and somber landscape, a quiet space where she could feel the echoes of his pain as if they were her own. Alara, too, was haunted. The face of the man she had shot at the window, his expression of shock frozen in the flash of gunpowder, was seared into her memory. The final, shocking image of Silas's death replayed itself in her mind. The act of taking a life, even a life so steeped in evil, had left a scar on her soul. She would often wake with a strangled scream, the deafening roar of the shotgun blast echoing in her ears, the phantom kick of the recoil jarring her shoulder. In those dark, haunted hours, they learned to comfort each other. He would pull her close, his newly regained strength a comfort, and hold her until the trembling subsided. He would say nothing, but his presence was a steady, silent promise that she was not alone in the wreckage of that night. Their shared trauma, the ghosts they both carried, created a bond between them that was deeper and more unbreakable than any vow spoken before a preacher. A major turning point in their healing came one cool afternoon when Caleb was finally strong enough to walk around the property, leaning heavily on a carved stick. He saw the full extent of the damage with clear, sober eyes, the pockmarked walls, the splintered corral, the dark, scorched patch of earth where the cottonwood tree had burned. He found Alara sitting by the newly repaired corral fence, her hands idle in her lap, staring out at the horizon. Her expression was distant and lost, as if a part of her spirit had fled and could not find its way back. He sat down beside her on the sun-warmed wood. He did not offer empty platitudes or tell her that everything would be all right. He knew, as she did, that they would never be the same people they were before the siege. Instead, he began to talk about the future. He did not speak in grand, abstract terms, but in small, tangible, concrete details. "The roan is gone," he said, his voice still raspy. "We will need a new horse before winter, a good, strong one." He pointed with his chin toward the damaged barn. "And that section of the roof will not last another snow. We will need to rebuild it." He fell silent for a moment, his gaze drifting up to the small, empty hill that overlooked the cabin. "My mother always wanted to plant an orchard," he said softly. "Apple trees. She said a home is not a home until it has roots in the ground that will outlive you." He looked at Alara, his gray eyes serious and full of a quiet conviction. "We should plant them in the spring, a few saplings to start." For the first time, he used the word we so naturally, so inclusively, that it wrapped around Alara's wounded heart like a warm blanket. He was not just talking about rebuilding a ranch. He was talking about building a life, a future, with her. This simple, forward-looking statement, this belief in a spring that was yet to come, was a powerful anchor. It pulled her from the drowning depths of the past and gave her a fragile, hopeful glimpse of a possible future with him. From that day forward, they began the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding, not just the ranch, but their lives. The physical labor was a balm, a therapy for their bruised souls, mending fences, re-chinking the cabin walls with fresh mud and straw, and clearing away the last remnants of the fight became a ritual of reclamation. With every swing of the hammer, with every board nailed into place, they were cleansing their home, making it their own again. During this work, They talked more than they ever had before. They shared small, quiet dreams as they worked side by side. Ilara confessed one evening that she had always wanted to learn to read more than just the simple words she could already decipher. She spoke of the power that seemed to be locked away in books, a power she had always craved. Caleb, whose mother had been a schoolteacher before she married, nodded slowly. That night, by the soft light of the kerosene lamp, he took down his mother's worn copy of the Bible from a high shelf. The pages were thin and soft with age. "We will start here," he said. And so, their lessons began. His large, calloused finger would trace the lines of text, and his low, patient voice would sound out the words, helping her piece them together. These lessons were intimate and quiet, a symbol of the new life he was offering her, one of knowledge and self-worth. Not just survival. He was giving her a key to a world she had never been allowed to enter. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Caleb sat by the fire mending a piece of tack, Ilara took a significant step in her own healing. She went to the small wooden chest in their bedroom and took out the single white cotton glove she had kept tucked away, the last remaining symbol of her past life. She walked back into the main room, her steps measured and deliberate. Without a word, she stood before the fireplace and dropped the glove into the crackling flames. They watched together as the pristine white fabric, the symbol of her shame and her fear, hesitated for a moment in the heat, then curled, blackened, and turned to ash. It was a quiet, solemn ceremony of liberation. From that day on, she never tried to hide her branded hand. The scar was no longer a source of shame, but a testament to her survival. It was a part of her story, a map of the brutal path that had, against all odds, led her to this place, to this man. Their love, which had been forged in the desperate, fiery passion of the siege, now deepened and mellowed into a quiet, powerful partnership. It became a steady, abiding affection built on a foundation of profound respect. They learned to find a quiet joy in the simple, everyday moments, watching the sunrise together from the porch with a shared cup of coffee, working in a comfortable, easy silence in the garden, the simple, solid warmth of their bodies next to each other in the bed at night. The landscape, which had once seemed so alien and threatening to Ilara, now felt like home. She no longer saw its emptiness, but its endurance, the vastness of the Wyoming sky, and the stubborn resilience of the prairie grasses became a reflection of their own hard-won peace and the boundless future they could now dare to imagine together. The story concludes a year later. It is autumn again, and the air is crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and curing hay. Ilara is pregnant, her body swollen with the tangible, living symbol of their new life and their hope for the future. Caleb has kept his promise. On the hill overlooking the homestead, a small, neat row of apple saplings stands braced against the wind, their roots taking hold in the rich, dark earth. They stand there together on the hill, his arm wrapped securely around her, looking down at their small, scarred, but now whole homestead. The cabin still bears the marks of the fight, a few unrepaired bullet holes, a slight discoloration on the wood where blood had soaked in, but they are no longer wounds. They are now just a part of its history, a part of their history. Caleb gently takes her left hand in his thumb tracing the faint, silvery lines of the sea. He no longer sees Silas's mark of ownership. He sees Ilara's strength, her courage, her impossible will to survive. "It is a part of you," he says softly, his voice full of a love that is as vast and as steady as the land around them. "It is the path that brought you home." Ilara leans her head against his shoulder, her free hand resting on her swollen belly, where their child, a new life born of love and survival, rests beneath her heart. The story does not end with a promise of a life without hardship, for the West is an unforgiving place, but it ends with the quiet, powerful certainty that whatever comes, whatever storms may gather on the horizon, they will face it together. They have found more than just survival in the harsh, unforgiving landscape. They have found justice. They have found redemption. And they have found a love strong enough to heal the deepest of wounds. Thank you for being part of our story tonight. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.